Have you ever watched a billion-dollar tech empire burn down over a single arrogant mouse click? He thought severing my secure network connection in the dead of night was just a petty power play. That terrible boss had no idea his action triggered a digital time bomb, nuking a $200 million insurance policy and turning his golden future to ash. Pay close attention. This is a masterpiece of corporate execution. Hello to our amazing audience at Boss Revenge Stories, and thank you so much for your continued support. Recently, YouTube disabled our channel monetization, leaving us without an operating budget to keep bringing you these incredible tales. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon channel to hear even better, longer, and more detailed exclusive true stories, with multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot make public on YouTube, which you can access by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us get into today's story, as I, Charlie Morales, take you through the exact blueprint of a corporate execution. I am 32 years old, and I am a network infrastructure architect. But in the neon-lit, hyper-caffeinated corridors of Ethernode logistics, my official title might as well be the designated roadblock. Ethernode is a logistics giant that moves highly sensitive medical specimens, experimental vaccines, and volatile biochemicals across the country using a massive fleet of autonomous, self-driving freight trucks. These rigs are essentially rolling, heavily armored refrigerators carrying the fragile future of medicine, requiring absolute, unwavering temperature stability. I designed from scratch the firewall architecture that keeps the digital brains of those trucks safe from hijackers, ransomware syndicates, and corporate espionage. In the 21st century American corporate landscape, specifically within the fiercely competitive tech sector, there is a sickening worship of those who move fast and break things. The company culture here was suffocatingly toxic and overwhelmingly chaotic. The executives threw massive parties to celebrate the rule breakers, the disruptors, and the smooth talkers who promised the moon to investors while delivering broken code and half-baked ideas. Meanwhile, people like me, the meticulous engineers keeping the company from collapsing into a fiery legal disaster, were treated as an annoying nuisance. They viewed my strict, uncompromising security protocols as frustrating obstacles standing directly in the way of their aggressive quarterly growth metrics. But Ethernode could not survive a single week without my intense paranoia. My most critical responsibility happened every single Friday night. As the ambitious corporate drones emptied out of the glass building to hit the downtown bars, I stayed behind in the freezing server room to initiate the weekly lockdown sequence. Every Friday evening, I had to manually activate a military-grade encrypted virtual private network tunnel. This was not some standard corporate internet connection. This was a vital, hardened digital lifeline that synchronized the micro-level temperature logs from hundreds of autonomous medical containers directly back to our central mainframe. The stakes attached to this process were absolutely astronomical. Ethernode carried a massive $200 million liability insurance policy backed by Sentinel Prime liability. The terms of that specific contract were written in absolute, unforgiving concrete. If that encrypted connection dropped for even one single minute during the synchronization window, Sentinel Prime would automatically flag the entire multi-state shipment as unverifiably safe. A 60-second data blackout meant the insurance company would flat-out refuse any financial compensation if a payload spoiled. It did not matter if the vaccines were perfectly frozen upon physical inspection. Without the continuous encrypted chain of custody data flowing through my network, the cargo was legally considered compromised garbage. I was the invisible guardian standing squarely between the company and total financial ruin. And then came Julian Vance. Julian was our newly appointed Chief Innovation Officer, a fabricated title that essentially meant he was paid an obscene amount of money to spout meaningless buzzwords and make things look shiny for the venture capitalists. He was a hollow, arrogant tech bro freshly transplanted from Silicon Valley, walking around the office like he personally owned the entire building. Julian had a wardrobe consisting entirely of expensive black turtlenecks and limited edition designer sneakers. He loved to throw around the word optimize in every single conversation, treating it like a magical incantation that could wave away any fundamental engineering limitation. From the exact moment he stepped off the executive elevator, Julian made it his mission to establish dominance over the technical departments. He took one brief look at my meticulously crafted network security infrastructure and loudly declared it the bloated relic of a bygone era. To a guy like Julian, robust firewalls, multi-factor authentication, and unbreakable encryption were just heavy, unsexy things slowing down his grand vision of a frictionless corporate experience. He did not care about the volatile biochemicals resting in the autonomous trucks speeding down the highway, and he certainly did not understand the perilous legal tightrope we walked with Sentinel Prime liability. He only cared about optics, maximizing server bandwidth for his pet projects, and feeding his own massively inflated ego. Every time we crossed paths in the break room or the hallways, he made sure to drop condescending remarks about how I needed to be more agile. "Charlie, we need to optimize our data flow and stop living in the dark ages of redundant security," he would say, flashing a blinding artificial smile that never quite reached his cold eyes. I ignored his arrogance as best as I could. My job was not to be liked by the new chief innovation officer. My job was to make sure our fleet of self-driving laboratories did not get hacked, and to ensure that a $200 million insurance policy remained perfectly intact. I knew the systems inside and out. I built the digital walls. I knew exactly what catastrophic failure would look like if someone tried to tear those walls down just for the sake of looking innovative to the board of directors. I was perfectly content to stay in my dimly lit server room and let Julian play his shallow corporate games, as long as he stayed completely out of my network. But guys like Julian never know when to stop. They always have to push the boundaries. They always have to prove they are the smartest person in the room, and they always genuinely believe the rules do not apply to them. He was about to learn a very hard, very expensive lesson about what happens when you try to optimize a system you do not even begin to understand. The tension did not remain confined to passive-aggressive comments in the break room or condescending glances in the hallways. It quickly escalated into direct, structural interference. Julian began overstepping his boundaries with alarming speed, plunging his manicured hands deep into the infrastructure department. He decided to make an example out of me during the monthly all-hands operational meeting. With over 200 employees dialed in and the entire executive board sitting at the massive mahogany table, he pulled up a slide showing the network resource allocation. He pointed a red laser pointer right at my security protocols, sighing loudly into the microphone. "Look at this massive bottleneck," he announced, his voice dripping with theatrical exasperation. "Charlie here is our resident digital paranoid. She is building doomsday bunkers while the rest of us are trying to build rocket ships to the moon. We cannot scale our operations, and we certainly cannot attract modern venture capitalists. If we are utterly terrified of our own shadow—" The room echoed with the sycophantic laughter of his newly hired marketing team. I sat perfectly still in the back row, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. He was deliberately confusing vital, life-saving armor with unnecessary weight, and he was doing it purely for cheap applause. Emboldened by the complete lack of pushback from the spineless executive board, Julian issued a direct mandate the very next week. He ordered a severe, immediate cut to the bandwidth allocated to the Security and Compliance Department. His reasoning was as infuriating as it was absurd. He was developing a virtual reality presentation designed specifically to dazzle potential investors at the upcoming quarterly review. He wanted these billionaire investors to put on heavy headsets and virtually walk through a simulated, neon-glowing futuristic logistics hub. It was a completely useless, purely cosmetic vanity project that had absolutely nothing to do with actually delivering medical supplies. Yet, it required a staggering amount of server compute power and raw network speed to render the three-dimensional graphics. To feed his shiny digital toy, he choked the life out of the real, breathing infrastructure that kept our actual operations running legally. I filed 3 separate risk assessment reports, explicitly warning that stripping our bandwidth would leave the emergency communication channels dangerously narrow in the event of a crisis. He deleted every single one of them without a single reply. The consequences of his monumental arrogance arrived with brutal swiftness on a Friday night in mid-January. A massive, unpredicted blizzard slammed violently into the eastern seaboard. The regional weather models had completely failed, and within a matter of 4 hours, major interstate highways from Virginia all the way up to Massachusetts were buried under feet of driving snow and thick sheets of black ice. Our fleet of autonomous trucks, programmed with incredibly strict self-preservation algorithms, reacted exactly as they were engineered to do. When visibility dropped to 0 and the tire traction control sensors registered critical failure, the artificial intelligence executed emergency pull-over maneuvers. Dozens of heavily armored vehicles carrying highly sensitive, volatile shipments were suddenly stranded on the dark shoulders of frozen highways in the dead of night. I was alone in the underground server room. The relentless hum of the massive cooling fans, the only sound in the empty building. The temperature outside those stranded trucks was plummeting to -10 degrees Fahrenheit. But the internal cargo bays holding the experimental medical specimens had to be maintained at precisely 2 degrees Celsius. The truck cooling and heating systems were now draining the auxiliary batteries just to fight the freezing ambient temperature. I had to initiate the emergency virtual private network protocol immediately. This was not a standard data sync. This was a massive, resource-heavy data pipeline designed to continuously stream the micro-temperature logs from every single stationary truck directly to the insurance company servers in real time. It was the absolute only way to prove the cargo was still viable while the vehicles were not moving. The legal contract was merciless. If the data flow choked and the connection broke, the insurance monitors would automatically trip, and tens of millions of dollars of vaccines would be mathematically declared dead, regardless of their actual physical state. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I forced the heavy encrypted tunnel open, because Julian had slashed my bandwidth allocation to a fraction of what it used to be. The system was struggling violently, wheezing and lagging under the immense weight of the incoming telemetry data. The progress bar on my main monitor crawled forward with agonizing, heart-pounding slowness. 10%, 30%, 50%. The tension in the sterile room was absolutely suffocating. I did not blink. I barely breathed. My eyes locked on the fluctuating transfer rates, the fate of the entire regional supply chain, and the financial survival of the company rested entirely on that fragile, artificially narrow digital thread. It finally reached 80%. The finish line was agonizingly close. Just a few more minutes of sustained connection, and the emergency synchronization would be securely locked in with the insurance auditors. I let out a shallow breath of relief. And then, the sharp, jarring chime of a Slack notification echoed loudly through the quiet room. A message box popped up on the top right corner of my screen. It was from Julian. "Charlie," the message read, completely devoid of any professional courtesy or awareness of the unfolding weather crisis. "I need you to kill your background tasks and yield all server bandwidth to the staging environment right now. I am running the final compile for the virtual reality demo for the board meeting tomorrow morning, and my render is lagging badly. Drop whatever you are doing and clear the pipes." I stared at the glowing pixels of the incoming message, my hands momentarily hovering frozen over the mechanical keyboard. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his demand was staggering. The progress bar for the vital data synchronization was hovering right at the 80% mark, holding the fate of a massive pharmaceutical payload together by a fragile digital thread. I did not waste time crafting a diplomatic response. I did not employ the soft, passive-aggressive corporate language usually reserved for managing fragile executive egos. I typed my reply with heavy, deliberate keystrokes, injecting the cold, hard reality of our legal obligations directly into his private messaging channel. "Request absolutely denied," I typed back, hitting the keys so hard they echoed in the quiet server room. Active synchronization is currently in critical progress for emergency fleet grounding due to severe weather. I am strictly bound by the Sentinel Prime liability contract. Refer specifically to Section 14.b, which states clearly, disconnection prohibited during container data synchronization. Severing this specific network pipeline before completion will instantly and permanently void the $200 million policy covering the stranded assets. Yielding bandwidth for a virtual reality environment is not an option under any circumstances. I pressed the Enter key and watched the tiny icon at the bottom of the chat window indicate that he was reading my response. I could vividly imagine the exact shade of crimson creeping up his neck. Julian was an executive who had spent his entire career in environments where reality bent to his will simply because he held a higher rank. He was entirely unaccustomed to being told no, and he was especially intolerant of being educated on compliance protocols by someone he viewed as an obsolete roadblock to his grand visionary projects. He did not reply with a coherent argument. He did not ask for clarification regarding the insurance stipulations. Instead, he chose to reply with brute, catastrophic force. A few weeks prior, Julian had aggressively bullied the human resources and information technology departments into granting his user profile global super-administrator privileges. He claimed it was necessary to foster cross-departmental synergy and eliminate administrative bottlenecks. It was a terrifying level of unrestricted access handed to a man who possessed absolutely zero understanding of the underlying network architecture. Now, he was weaponizing that unearned authority against the very company he was supposed to help lead. My secondary monitor, dedicated entirely to tracking active internal network sessions and core command inputs, suddenly lit up with a massive spike in unauthorized command line activity. An external administrative terminal had locked onto the central mainframe cluster from an IP address originating directly from the executive penthouse suite. He was completely bypassing the standard user interface, ignoring all the warning prompts, and digging his hands directly into the core command shell. He was not just attempting to pause my synchronization process to steal a fraction of the bandwidth, he was initiating a system-wide forced termination command, an aggressive override designed only to kill malicious rogue programs. Time seemed to dilate, stretching every single second into an agonizingly long sequence of events. I watched the forensic evidence of his actions scroll rapidly down my terminal window in bright green text. He targeted the specific process identification number assigned to the military-grade encrypted virtual private network tunnel. He typed the fatal execution command and initiated the strike. The physical reaction within the underground server room was instantaneous and deeply unsettling. The heavy rhythmic thrum of the massive data processing racks pitched downward sharply, whining into a sudden, sickening silence as the massive computational load was violently wiped away. My main monitor, previously illuminated with the steady, reassuring flow of life-saving telemetry data, violently flashed pitch black. The silence in the room was deafening. When the high-resolution screen finally flickered back to life, the comforting green progress bar was completely gone. In its place, a cold, gray system prompt stared back at me from the center of the display. It bore a simple, devastating message. Connection terminated by executive server. On the digital geographic map of the eastern seaboard, displayed on my third monitor, the visual representation of the disaster unfolded. 342 glowing green dots, each representing a heavily armored autonomous truck battling the freezing blizzard on the highways, simultaneously turned a dead, lifeless gray. The secure cryptographic handshake was broken. The continuous chain of custody was officially shattered. In a fraction of a second, an ocean of vital medical data was lost to the void. Less than a minute later, a second notification pierced the deadly quiet of the room. It was Julian again. His tone was dripping with unwarranted arrogance and a catastrophic level of ignorance regarding the sheer scale of the destruction he had just caused. "Do not overreact, girl. Just let the system run it again tomorrow morning. I am the boss. I take responsibility." He actually typed those exact words. He willingly left a permanent, highly incriminating written record of his monumental stupidity on the company servers. I sat back slowly in my ergonomic chair, letting the soft leather absorb my weight. A lesser engineer might have reached frantically for the emergency phone to call the incident response team. Another person might have screamed in sheer frustration or desperately attempted to reboot the encrypted tunnel to salvage whatever data remained. But reconnecting now was completely, utterly useless. The insurance monitoring algorithms embedded in the Sentinel Prime network had already logged the blackout. The policy was dead. The cargo was legally spoiled. Instead of succumbing to panic, a profound icy calm washed over me. The anxiety that had gripped my chest all evening completely evaporated. I did not touch the system restart sequence. I simply smiled. It was a cold, forensic smile, devoid of any joy, fueled entirely by the realization that my enemy had just handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy him. Moving with the slow, methodical precision of a crime scene investigator documenting a fatality, I began preserving the digital corpse he had just left on my desk. I initiated a deep system screen capture protocol, locking down the exact server timestamps, the abruptly severed connection logs, and his damning chat messages. I dug deeper into the security event viewer, meticulously extracting his unique machine identification code, the physical media access control address of his laptop, and the precise keystroke logs of his forced termination command. I gathered every microscopic crumb of digital evidence and bundled it into a highly encrypted, read-only archive. Then, I opened a hidden command terminal buried far beneath the standard operating system interface. Months ago, anticipating that someone in the executive suite would eventually try to violently override my safety protocols, I had meticulously crafted and embedded a dormant piece of code deep within the server kernel. I called it my digital dead man switch. It was completely undetectable by standard security sweeps, sleeping silently in the shadows of the network infrastructure. I typed the activation phrase. The script silently awoke from its hibernation. I permanently bound the encrypted evidence archive containing Julian's actions to the switch. I programmed the logical parameters to trigger automatically the moment any external forensic audit request was received from the insurance company. The trap was now fully armed, buried under layers of complex code, waiting patiently for the inevitable explosion that would happen on Monday morning. I locked my workstation, stood up, and calmly walked out into the freezing night. By the time the sun rose on Monday morning, the catastrophic reality of Friday night had fully materialized into a corporate nightmare. I walked into the main operations center at 8 o'clock sharp to find the entire floor in a state of absolute, unmitigated chaos. Red warning lights bathed the room in a bloody glow, and automated alarm sirens were sounding softly but persistently from the dispatch terminals. Over the weekend, while the autonomous trucks were stranded in the blizzard, a series of micro-voltage fluctuations had cascaded through the auxiliary power systems of 30 different transport vehicles. In a normal scenario, my uninterrupted data stream would have proven that the backup generators kicked in perfectly to keep the internal cargo bays at exactly 2 degrees Celsius. But because my secure connection had been brutally severed, there was a total information blackout. Sentinel Prime liability did not hesitate. Their automated compliance algorithms instantly flagged an entire payload of specialized cancer treatments and experimental vaccines, a shipment with a staggering street value of $70 million, as permanently spoiled due to unverified temperature control. The executive board was in a state of full-blown panic. Their precious profit margins were suddenly vaporizing right in front of their eyes. Representatives from Sentinel Prime Liability were already demanding full, unrestricted access to our core network logs to determine if the blackout was a random hardware failure or a case of gross human negligence. When Julian heard the insurance auditors were getting involved, the cold reality of his arrogant actions finally pierced through his thick skull. He realized instantly that his vanity project had just cost the company $70 million in a single night. But guys like Julian never take responsibility. Despite what they type in a private chat message, when faced with the destruction they cause, their immediate instinct is self-preservation at any cost. He went into full cover-up mode, knowing his own technical skills were entirely inadequate to clean up the mess he made. Julian quietly hired a shady, out-of-network freelance engineer to scrub his digital fingerprints from the system. Throughout Sunday night, while I was sleeping peacefully, this hired gun had been digging through the server directories, actively backdating system event files, and maliciously modifying the server health logs. They fabricated a highly technical, completely fictitious narrative. The forged documents painted a picture of a massive systemic software glitch caused entirely by my failure to perform routine maintenance on the routing hardware. They made it look like the system simply collapsed under its own weight due to my alleged negligence. Just before lunch, my desk phone rang. It was the Director of Human Resources, asking me to come up to the executive suite immediately. When I walked into the sterile, glass-walled conference room, I found Julian sitting at the head of the table, flanked by the head of Human Resources and a corporate lawyer. Julian had completely transformed his demeanor. Gone was the aggressive, sneering tech bro from Friday night. In his place sat a deeply concerned, solemnly disappointed leader. He had rehearsed this performance down to the very last sigh. "Charlie," Julian began, his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy, "we are facing a crisis of unprecedented scale. As I'm sure you are aware, the network failure over the weekend resulted in the loss of a $70 million payload. We brought in an independent forensic team to review the server architecture, and unfortunately, the preliminary logs indicate a severe lapse in basic maintenance protocols on your end. The system choked because the routing tables were not properly flushed." He paused, letting the heavy accusation hang in the air, waiting for me to panic, to cry, or to launch into a desperate, furious defense. When I remained completely silent, he pressed on, leaning forward slightly. "Given the astronomical financial impact of this failure and the ongoing investigation by Sentinel Prime, we have no choice but to place you on immediate, unpaid administrative leave pending a full internal review. I am so sorry. Charlie, I really wanted you to succeed here." The Human Resources Director slid a manila folder across the smooth table, demanding my company identification badge, my security keys, and my corporate laptop. This was the exact moment Julian expected a fight. He expected me to scream about his late-night override, to point fingers, and to demand a deeper investigation. If I had done that, it would have validated his narrative that I was just a frantic, defensive employee caught in a lie. Instead, I gave him absolutely nothing. I did not utter a single word of protest. I did not defend myself or mention the contract stipulations. I simply offered a curt, almost imperceptible nod. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my security lanyard, and placed it gently on top of the manila folder. I turned around and walked out of the glass room with my head held high, leaving them sitting in absolute silence. As the elevator doors closed, I caught one final glimpse of Julian through the glass. He was leaning back in his chair, a smug, victorious smirk playing on his lips. He genuinely believed he had won. He thought I was running away in defeat. He had absolutely no idea that my silence was not a surrender. It was the quiet ticking of the digital bomb I had planted, counting down the seconds until the ultimate detonation. The inevitable reckoning arrived precisely at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning. Ethernode Logistics convened an emergency. High-level executive summit in the grand boardroom on the top floor. The atmosphere inside the room was incredibly suffocating, thick with the smell of expensive cologne, stale coffee, and raw corporate panic. The entire C-suite was present, from the chief executive officer pacing anxiously near the floor-to-ceiling windows, to the grim-faced internal legal counsel gripping their leather-bound notepads with white knuckles. Sitting directly across from them, forming an impenetrable wall of tailored charcoal suits, was the lead investigative audit team from Sentinel Prime Liability. They did not drink the coffee offered to them. They did not engage in small talk. They were there to determine the fate of a $200 million policy, and they operated with the absolute ruthlessness of apex predators. At the head of the massive mahogany table stood Julian. He was wearing a fresh black turtleneck, projecting an aura of absolute control and unwavering confidence. He had spent the last 48 hours perfectly rehearsing this exact presentation, convinced that his hired hacker had scrubbed the internal servers completely clean. He dimmed the overhead lights and fired up the high-resolution projector, displaying the heavily fabricated system health reports on the massive wall screen. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, and our esteemed partners from Sentinel Prime," Julian began, his voice smooth and deeply reassuring. "After a rigorous internal forensic investigation over the past few days, we have successfully isolated the root cause of the network blackout that unfortunately compromised the $70 million shipment. It brings me absolutely no pleasure to report this, but the failure was entirely the result of gross negligence at the individual contributor level." He clicked his wireless remote, bringing up a complex-looking, utterly fake timeline of server activity. "Our former network infrastructure architect, Charlie Morales, fundamentally failed to maintain the routing tables required to handle emergency data loads," Julian explained, pointing his red laser pointer at the fabricated data spikes on the graph. "When the severe blizzard hit and the autonomous fleet pulled over, the system attempted to execute the standard telemetry synchronization. However, because she had deliberately ignored critical software updates and allowed the memory cache to bloat over several months, the system experienced a fatal memory overflow and crashed. It was a tragic, isolated human error. We have already terminated her employment and are currently restructuring the entire security department to ensure this never happens again." The chief executive officer let out a heavy, audible sigh of relief, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. Blaming a low-level, supposedly rogue engineer was the easiest, cleanest way out of a massive corporate disaster. The internal lawyers nodded in quiet agreement, already mentally drafting the legal defense based on employee negligence. Julian offered a solemn, practiced nod of fake sorrow, turning back to the auditors to await their final blessing. The boardroom remained dead silent for a long, incredibly uncomfortable moment. The lead auditor for Sentinel Prime, a silver-haired man with terrifyingly sharp eyes, did not even look at Julian's carefully crafted presentation. He was staring down at a slim, highly encrypted tablet resting on the table in front of him. He slowly reached up, adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses, and looked directly at Julian. "Mr. Vance," the lead auditor said, his voice slicing through the thick air like a surgical scalpel. "The data you just projected onto that screen makes for a very compelling narrative. However, it does not match the blockchain." Julian completely froze. His confident, arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I am sorry. The what? We do not run our internal server logs on a blockchain infrastructure. That is not how Ethernode operates." "We are fully aware of your standard internal infrastructure," the auditor replied, his tone chillingly flat and devoid of emotion. "But your former network architect was apparently much more proactive than you realized. Sentinel Prime Liability operates an independent, immutable cryptographic ledger to verify high-value telemetry. It is an optional security layer we offer to our most high-risk clients to prevent internal tampering. We assumed Ethernode had simply not opted in, but it appears Ms. Morales privately integrated a dormant reporting protocol deep within your operating system kernel many months ago." The color began to violently drain from Julian's face. The chief executive officer sat up straight, his brief moment of relief instantly vanishing into thin air. The auditor tapped the glowing screen of his tablet. "When we initiated our formal audit request on Monday morning, it triggered a hidden dead man switch embedded securely in your network architecture, but this specific script did not just send us a backup file of your local, easily modifiable logs. It revealed that during the exact moment of the network failure on Friday night, the system generated a real-time, mathematically unalterable cryptographic hash of your core command shell. It bypassed your internal corporate storage entirely and wrote the raw forensic truth directly onto our external decentralized ledger." Julian gripped the edges of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He opened his mouth to speak, to object, to spin another desperate lie, but his throat was entirely dry. "Allow me to show the room what actually happened," the auditor continued relentlessly, plugging a secure digital cable from his tablet directly into the boardroom display system. Julian's fabricated slides vanished instantly. In their place, a stark, high-contrast terminal window appeared on the massive screen. It was the exact evidence package I had carefully bundled and tied to the dead man switch. There was absolutely nowhere left for him to hide. At exactly 11:42 at night, the auditor narrated coldly, reading the undeniable truth projected behind him. The secure virtual private network was not overwhelmed by a memory overflow. It was intentionally and violently terminated from the executive penthouse terminal. We have the exact machine identification code. We have the unique physical media access control address of your specific laptop, Mr. Vance. Furthermore, we have the biometric fingerprint authorization proving it was you, personally, sitting at the keyboard executing the override. The entire C-suite erupted into panicked, furious whispers. The chief executive officer stared at the massive screen in absolute, unadulterated horror. And finally, the auditor said, raising his voice just enough to cut through the rising chaos in the room, he clicked his presentation remote one final time. A giant, high-resolution image of the internal Slack chat log completely dominated the wall. We have the written motive. While the synchronization was successfully holding at 80%, you ordered the vital connections severed to allocate server bandwidth for a virtual reality demonstration. When warned explicitly about the strict terms of our insurance contract, you overrode the system anyway. The arrogant words I had meticulously captured glowed brightly on the screen for the entire executive board to read. Do not overreact, girl. Just let the system run it again tomorrow morning. I am the boss. I take responsibility. Julian Vance stood utterly paralyzed at the head of the table. His perfectly tailored designer suit suddenly looked like a suffocating straitjacket. He looked frantically around the room, his eyes wide with wild, unadulterated terror. Searching desperately for a single friendly face, he found none. The internal corporate lawyers were glaring at him with pure, murderous hatred. The chief executive officer looked as though he was about to physically lunge across the massive table and tear Julian apart with his bare hands. The digital trap had sprung with absolute, flawless perfection, wrapping its cold steel jaws around his throat and crushing his intricate web of lies into fine dust. The lead auditor for Sentinel Prime stood up from the heavy mahogany table with a chilling finality. He closed his thick leather binder, the sharp thud echoing violently through the dead silence of the room. Based on irrefutable evidence of intentional, malicious administrative sabotage, he declared, his voice devoid of any sympathy. The fundamental compensation clause has been catastrophically breached. Your $200 million insurance contract is officially and permanently voided. The room detonated. It was a spectacular implosion of corporate hubris. The internal legal team began shouting over each other, desperately trying to formulate a damage control strategy that simply did not exist. The chief executive officer, a man who had built this logistics empire from the ground up and was now staring directly into the abyss of total bankruptcy, slowly turned his head toward the head of the table. The look he gave Julian Vance was not just angry, it was utterly murderous, a silent promise of absolute professional destruction. Julian did not even get the chance to pack his own desk. He was unceremoniously fired exactly where he stood, his designer turtleneck suddenly drenched in cold sweat. The chief executive officer barked a single order, and within 2 minutes, a pair of heavily built private security guards entered the boardroom. They flanked the former chief innovation officer, gripping him tightly by the arms, and physically escorted him out of the executive suite. But losing his job was merely the appetizer. The internal legal counsel, eager to throw a sacrificial lamb to the furious federal regulators, immediately began drafting the paperwork to hand Julian over to the authorities. He was not just facing public disgrace. He was walking straight into a massive criminal lawsuit for intentionally falsifying federal-level financial and corporate compliance data. While the executive suite burned to the ground, I was sitting comfortably in a quiet, warmly lit corner booth at a small Italian espresso bar directly across the street from the Ethernode headquarters. The heavy skies had finally broken, pouring a relentless winter rain over the gray pavement. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark roast coffee, letting the rich warmth wash over me. Through the rain-streaked window, I watched the grand glass doors of the corporate lobby swing open. Julian Vance stumbled out onto the wet sidewalk. He had no umbrella. He was awkwardly clutching a damp cardboard box containing a few miserable desk plants and his collection of useless management books. The arrogant executive who thought he owned the world just a few days ago was now shivering in the freezing downpour, completely broken and entirely alone. I watched him trudge toward the subway station, a pathetic silhouette fading into the storm, right at that perfectly cinematic moment. My cell phone buzzed on the wooden table. The caller identification displayed the private, direct number of the chief executive officer. I let it ring 3 times, building the suspense, before calmly swiping the screen to answer. The man who had silently allowed my suspension just a few days prior was now begging. He pleaded with me to come back immediately, to completely rebuild the network infrastructure with absolute transparency, and to help him salvage whatever fragile trust remained with the furious shareholders. I listened to his desperate rambling with a cold, satisfied smile. When he finally paused to catch his breath, I delivered my final verdict. "I will return," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "But my title is now Chief Information Security Officer, and my salary just tripled. Thank you so much, from the bottom of my heart, to our incredible audience for listening to this story. We would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. So please let us know in the comments below. If you found today's corporate execution satisfying and want to help us keep this channel alive, please consider supporting Boss Revenge Stories by joining our Patreon. There, you can listen to the absolute best, highly detailed, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the Patreon QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the direct link provided in the video description or the pinned comment.